lied about a continent, this is not Africa. The name Africa is not the true name of this land. And by the time you finish this, you will feel it. Not just know it, feel it in your chest. Because this is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. For your entire life, you have spoken a name that was handed to you by maps, by school books, by the evening news. A name repeated by anchors in polished studios, by teachers pointing at bright classroom globes, by politicians addressing the developing world with careful, distant words. Africa. One word, spoken as if it were neutral, as if it were ancient, as if it was sacred. But this land did not give itself that word. Conquerors did. You know how certain sounds hit you differently? When someone whispers, home, something inside you loosens. When you hear mother, there is a pull in your chest you cannot fully explain. When your own name is called, your body turns before your mind even decides. Names are not labels. They are cords tied to memory, to origin, to spirit. This land once had a name that carried that same weight, that same gravity, a name that held the story of people, of civilizations, of beginnings. And most people alive today have never heard it. This land was never one thing. That is the first truth most people miss. When people say Africa, they imagine one place, one culture, one story. But what you are seeing on that map is not a single identity. It is a patchwork of worlds, a continent that was a universe long before Rome drew borders and called one small province Africa Terra around defeated Carthage. From that narrow wound, that provincial word was stretched over deserts, forests, kingdoms, and empires it was never meant to hold. You need to understand the violence in that stretch, the quiet power of renaming. There were people on this land who carved their names into stone and temple walls. There were people here whose tongues shaped words like Kemet, Kush, Ethiopia, Ifriqiya, names that carried climate and color and covenant. There were scholars who spoke of Alkebulan, the mother of mankind, the Garden of Eden, long before school atlases flattened everything into Africa in bold colonial ink. Look again at the world you were taught. Every map you saw in childhood, every documentary, every breaking headline about war, disease, or African crisis, all repeating the same label until it felt natural. But what if that label is not neutral at all, but a weaponized half-truth, a word born in the mouths of outsiders, defining this land by what they saw, what they wanted, what they feared, instead of what it truly was? By the time you finish this, you will feel why that matters. Because before we speak the older name, the name tied to temples, stone, and ancient tongues, you need to understand why it was buried, who buried it, and what was stolen from you when the world agreed to call this land Africa. Let us go back, unlearning Africa, breaking the one-story illusion. Let us go back, not in maps and borders, but in the images inside your own head. When you hear the word Africa, what do you see? For most people, it is one picture, one place, one culture, one story. Endless savanna, a lion on a rock, a dusty village, flies on a child's face, a safari brochure on one side, charity commercial on the other. War, famine, corruption, third world chaos, all fused into one blurry idea. That is the first truth most people miss. That picture is new. That picture is shallow. That picture was built for you because this land was never one thing. Before the word Africa sat on school maps and news headlines, This land was a web of worlds. There were kingdoms that never saw themselves as neighbors, empires that called each other foreigners, spiritual systems that did not speak the same sacred names, lineages that traced their origin to different mountains, different rivers, different stars. There were the people of Kemet along the Nile. Speaking of Tamari and Kemet, not Africa. There were the Kushites further south, Nubian courts that looked north and saw Egypt as a rival, not a continent. There were the Ethiopians in the eyes of the Greeks, a word of reverence for dark-skinned people at the ends of the earth, not a single race on a single block of land. None of them walked under one banner called African. There were astronomer priests in stone temples, tracking Sirius and Orion with a precision that still humbles modern instruments. There were engineers aligning pillars and pyramids with solstices and equinoxes, reading time in shadows and light. There were traders moving gold, salt, and glass beads across deserts and forests, linking inland cities to Carthage, to Rome, to the wider world. There were jurists debating law in council rings and mosque courtyards long before European parliaments called themselves civilized. There were healers cataloging plants, metallurgists smelting iron, sailors following wind and current down the Swahili coast, philosophers arguing about justice and destiny in tongues you have never heard. This land held hundreds of languages, hundreds of names, hundreds of centers of power. You need to hear that, not just know it. Feel it in your chest. And here is what should unsettle you. All this existed long before a Roman mouth formed the word Africa, long before a European hand dragged that name across an entire continent. For most of human history, this land was Tamiri, Punt, Kush, Ifriqiya, Habasha, the lands of the Moors, the forests of the Akan, the plains of the Fulani. So, if the people of these civilizations did not wake up calling themselves Africans, whose idea are you living in when you say Africa today? This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning, because once you see that the one-story Africa is an invention, you will start to ask the question they never wanted you to ask. What was the older name of this land? The name that carried its true memory. Before Africa, the oldest land at the center of the world. So let us go back, not a few centuries, not to Rome, not even to Greece. Let us go back to a time before the word Europe meant anything at all, when the North was still learning to shape stone, while this land was already measuring the heavens. By the time the first Greek poets were telling stories of gods and heroes, there were people on this land who had already watched the Nile rise and fall for thousands of years. There were calendars here, tracking the floods. There were cities here, aligned to stars. There were kingdoms here, negotiating trade, law, and ritual, while the rest of the world was still trying to remember its own name. This land is not just old. It is one of the oldest cradles of humanity itself. In the great rift valleys, in places like Olduvai, the bones of our earliest ancestors lie buried in rock older than any empire. In caves and on cliff faces, from the Sahara to South Africa, rock art shows hunters, dancers, priests and queens, carved and painted by hands that moved across this soil long before Rome dreamed of Carthage. Fossils here whisper a brutal truth. Human beings have been walking, naming, and praying on this land longer than almost anywhere else on earth. That is the first truth most people miss. When you say Africa as if it were an afterthought, a blank space at the bottom of a map. You erase the fact that this land is the center from which so much human history radiates. And yet, as old as it is, its names have been peeled away, one conquest at a time. Empires do not just take territory. They take language. They take memory. They take the right to say what a place is called. You need to understand that every map you were shown in school was not neutral. It was a verdict. First came regional powers, then Greeks, then Rome, then the long shadow of European colonial rule. Each wave laid a new label over older ones like burial shrouds. Latin, Africa for a Roman province near Carthage. Arabic, Ifriqiya for a slice of the north. Later, European cartographers stretched those words over the whole body of this land until the original names were pushed into the margins or dismissed as tribal. But before that, there were names. Along the Nile, people called their land Kemet, the Black Land, and Tamiri, the Beloved Land. To the south, there was Kush and Nubia, realms that raised their own pyramids and dynasties. On the Red Sea coast, traders spoke of Punt, a sacred land of incense and gold. In the Horn, there was Aksum, a highland power with its own script, its own coins, its own vision of the world. People did not wake up calling themselves Africans. They woke up Kushite, Kemetic, Aksumite, Nubian, each rooted in their own soil, not in a single continental brand. Hold that in your mind, because before this video ends, we will return to one older, wider name. A name some traditions claim wrapped all these civilizations together. But to feel its weight, to not just know it, feel it in your chest, you must first walk deeper into the empires that carried it. And you must see how hard the world worked to bury it. The question is, what could be so dangerous about a name that an entire world order needed it forgotten? The name is just the surface. Why we can't rush the reveal? What could be so dangerous about a name that an entire world order needed it forgotten? You want the name now. Your mind is reaching for it, trying to grab it, hold it, repeat it. But if all you walk away with is a word you can recite, then this land gets reduced to a trivia answer, and something sacred gets flattened into a slogan. A name without memory is just a sound. That is the first truth most people miss. Names are not decorations. Names are the skin of a story. Underneath that skin, there are bones made of history, joints made of migrations and wars, blood made of lived experience, of languages, of prayers whispered into the soil. Without that, a name is empty. With it, a name becomes a key that can unlock identity, belonging, rage, and pride. You need to feel that difference, not just hear it, feel it in your chest, because this is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. If we throw the true name at you too fast, without rebuilding the world that birthed it, then we repeat the same violence Rome did, slapping labels on people they refuse to understand. So, let us go back. Let us go back before the school maps, before the straight lines of colonial borders, before Africa was printed in bold letters across a shape on a classroom wall. Let us go back before the word Africa was ever whispered, to a time when this land spoke for itself through river routes, caravan roads, constellations, and carved stone. In that older world, there was no single committee standing on a mountaintop announcing, "This is Africa." There were civilizations naming their horizons from where they stood. Along the Nile, people spoke of Kemet, the Black Land, and Tamiri, the Beloved Land. Further west, there were names tied to deserts and oases. In the highlands, names flowed from mountains and rains. There were people who called wide regions Ethiopia, not as one country, but as a world of burnt-faced peoples stretching far beyond what maps now show. There were names for valleys, for coasts, for kingdoms, for empires. Names for Numidians and Carthage and Kush. Names that saw this land not as a continent on the edge of someone else's world, but as mother, as origin, as center. What we are chasing is not a single perfect label to win an argument. We are chasing a worldview in which this land is womb, not wilderness. And yes, beneath all of that, there is a name preserved in temples and in oral traditions, a name cited in Afrocentric scholarship, whispered as mother of mankind, as Garden of Eden, a name some say once wrapped all these civilizations together like a wide, protective sky. By the time you finish this, you will feel it, but not yet. First, we have to walk back into the empires that carried it, and into the long, deliberate process by which that name was buried so Africa could rise in its place. When the land spoke first, civilizations before the word, Africa. Let us go back, not to the name on the map, but to the roar beneath it. Before Rome stamped Africa on a province, this land was already speaking in stone, in stars, in law, in blood. There were astronomer priests in Kemet, watching the sky with a discipline that would shame modern observatories, aligning pyramids with Orion's belt, timing the flooding of the Nile with the rising of Sirius, building a calendar so precise that later empires quietly folded its logic into their own. There were architects raising obelisks that still defy engineers, temples whose ceilings are painted with entire stellar maps, not as decoration, but as data. There were city builders in the Niger Bend, at places like Genegeno, raising earthen walls and planned streets while Europe was still groping in its own dark ages. There were stone masons further south, in the plateau we now call Zimbabwe, crafting great enclosures of granite without mortar, fitting each block so perfectly that the walls curved like frozen waves, holding memory, holding power. There were traders driving caravans across the Sahara, strings of camels carrying gold, salt, glass, and ideas from the forests of the interior to the harbors that once fed Carthage and beyond. There were sailors on the Swahili coast, from Kilwa to Mombasa, riding the monsoon winds into the Indian Ocean, trading with Arabia, India, even China, long before most people in Europe knew those routes existed. There were laws, customary courts under baobab trees where elders recited precedents from generations back, and written codes in places like Aksum and later Mali, blending spiritual duty with civil order. There were healers with vast herbal pharmacopoeias, surgeons in Kemet performing trepanations and setting fractures, physicians in Timbuktu writing treatises that would be copied and carried into the wider Islamic world. There were pantheons with intricate theologies, gods and ancestors interwoven with river and sky. And there were also strict monotheistic strains in Nubia, in Aksum. On this land, long before Europe claimed monopoly on the one, there were terraces carved into hillsides, irrigation channels guiding seasonal floods, ancient domestications of sorghum, millet, coffee, and yam that fed civilizations while the word Africa did not yet exist in their mouths. And these were not isolated sparks. Knowledge moved. It flowed up and down the Nile, across the Sahara, along the Swahili coast, into the deep interior. A medical recipe recorded in Kemet traveled with merchants. A legal principle refined in the Sahel echoed in court debates hundreds of miles away. An astronomical table preserved in a mosque library in Timbuktu drew from older observations made under a different sky, in a different tongue. Here is the pattern interrupt most people never face. Greek, Roman, and later Islamic sciences did not emerge from a vacuum. They drank from these wells. Greek philosophers studied in Egyptian temples. Roman agronomists borrowed irrigation methods that had been tested for centuries along African rivers. Islamic astronomers refined tables that rested on measurements first charted by pre-scientists of this land. The world applauded the borrowers and forgot the source. That is the first truth most people miss. All this depth, this brilliance, this web of civilizations existed before the word Africa was stretched to cover this land. These people did not wake up and call themselves Africans. They woke up Kemetu, Kushites, Ethiopians, Amazigh, Moors, Swahili, with names rooted in river, clan, God, and soil. You need to not just know it, feel it in your chest. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning, because once you see how much stood here before the foreign name arrived, you are ready to see how that name was weaponized, how Alkebulan was pushed into the shadows so Africa could become a cage the world would not question. Enter the Numidians, the horse masters, Rome, tried to forget, so let us go back. Not in theory, but in your imagination, to the ancient north of this land, to the strip where rugged hills and open plains lean down into the blue of the Mediterranean, where today you see Algeria and Tunisia on a map drawn by other hands. Stand there, feel the dry wind, see the broken ridges, the valleys, the long open grass. This land was not empty. This land carried hoofbeats. You need to stop and learn this name, Numidians. Say it, hold it, because these were not background characters in someone else's empire. These were riders, warriors, and political minds so sharp that Rome kept tripping over them. Yet most people passed through school without hearing them mentioned once. That is the first truth most people miss. The Numidians lived in those northern reaches between desert and sea, a people tuned to the rhythm of horse and horizon. They did not march like heavy infantry, they moved like wind. Their warriors rode bareback, no saddles, no bridles. Bodies fused to their horses through balance, knees, and sheer will. A pressure of the thigh, a shift of weight, a whisper, and the animal turned, surged, stopped. There were moments when Roman scouts saw nothing but empty plain. Then, in a breath, Numidian cavalry appeared in a storm of dust, circling, hurling javelins, vanishing before the legions could close ranks. There were columns of armored Romans sweating under iron and leather, and there were Numidians flowing around them, stinging, retreating, returning, never quite where Roman discipline expected them to be. Their legend is tied to a name you already know, Hannibal of Carthage, Rome's nightmare. When Hannibal crossed into Italy, dragging war elephants over mountains that Europe still marvels at, Numidian horsemen rode with him. At battles like Canon, where Roman armies were not just defeated, but humiliated, swallowed, and broken, Numidian cavalry smashed into Roman flanks, chased down fleeing soldiers, turned an organized army into a scattered, terrified mass. Later, when Carthage fell and Rome planted its eagle in the north, the Numidians did not simply disappear into Roman maps. Their kings, Massinissa, Jugurtha, and others, played a dangerous game, allying with Rome, then resisting Rome, using Roman generals, then fighting them in a high-stakes dance where a single misstep meant exile, chains, or death. And through all of this, understand the identity. These people call themselves Numidians. They traced lineages, spoke their own tongues, honored their own gods. They did not gather under a banner labeled Africa because that name did not yet swallow the whole of this land. For Rome, Africa at first was a narrow word, a province carved from the corpse of Carthage, a coastal strip around what is now Tunisia, an administrative box on a Roman ledger. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. The violence of taking a world of Numidians, Carthaginians, Cushites, Ethiopians, Moors, and pressing them into one foreign name. You need to see how Rome's small provincial label began to stretch, how an imperial word started creeping over maps until it tried to own the entire face of this land. Guerrillas versus empire. How Numidia shook Rome's confidence. Rome did not just stretch the name. It stretched its armies across this land. And here, on this very coastline, the empire discovered something it did not expect. Resistance that could run faster than its legions. Let us go back to the Numidians in motion. Light horses, no heavy armor, riders who grew up in the dust and heat of this land. At the Battle of Cannae, when Rome faced Carthage, it was Numidian cavalry that swarmed the Roman flanks, vanishing and returning, harassing, encircling, turning a battlefield into a trap. This land was not a backdrop. It was a weapon in their hands. Again and again, Numidian horsemen exposed Rome's weakness. They refused to stand still in neat lines. They cut supply routes, lured infantry into empty plains, then dissolved into the horizon. Roman generals, trained in European valleys and Italian hills, were forced to relearn how to fight under a sun that did not forgive and on a ground that answered to Numidian hooves, not Roman sandals. Then came a war that most people never hear about in school, the Jugurthine War. A Numidian king, Jugurtha, facing the greatest empire in the Mediterranean world, did not bow. He did not offer Rome a clean theatrical battle. He offered them mud, ambush, delay, night raids on camps, surprise attacks on convoys, bribes and broken alliances that turned Rome's own corruption against itself. For years, this one ruler from this land humiliated the Roman Senate. Roman writers admit it. They called Numidians swift, elusive, masters of the horse. They described Jugurtha as cunning, dangerous, a man who understood Roman greed and used it as a blade. There is admiration in their words, and there is fear, because this land had people who could make the empire stumble. But watch what happens next. The same writers who describe Numidians in detail begin to fold them into a single word: Africans. Rome conquers and the map changes. Numidia, with its kings and cavalry, is absorbed into a province called Africa Proconsularis. Distinct nations become administrative units. Names that carried memory are replaced by names that carry tax records. That is the first truth most people miss. Naming is not neutral. When an empire can rename your land as Africa and your people as Africans. It can also rewrite your role in history. Sovereign civilizations become auxiliaries. Jugurtha becomes a rebellious African. Numidian Genius becomes a regional flavor inside Rome's story. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. You need to see how the word Africa was built over the bones of older names, older powers, older victories that made Rome sweat. Because if the Numidians made Rome nervous, there was another power on this same coastline that made Rome question its own survival. A city of harbors and ships, of merchants and warlords, Carthage. And when Rome spoke that name, it did not think of provinces. It thought of extinction. By the time you're finished this, you will feel it. Carthage, the empire that almost rewrote Europe. Carthage was the nightmare on Rome's horizon, not a footnote, not a failed city-state, an empire of harbors and holes, of bronze rams and billowing sails, stretching across the western Mediterranean and the northern edge of this land. This land was not looking north and begging. It was looking out and ruling. That is the first truth most people miss. Carthage began as a Phoenician outpost, but it did not stay anyone's outpost. It grew into a maritime power that chained the sea with trade routes. There were Carthaginian colonies on the coasts of Iberia. There were strongholds on the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. There were ports all along the North African shore, from what you call Tunisia into Algeria and beyond, knitting this land to the wider world through commerce, tribute, and war. Its harbors were engineering masterpieces, double-ringed with inner basins for warships and outer docks for merchants. Fleets crisscrossed the sea, carrying silver from Iberia, dyes and timber from the Levant, grain from fertile North African plains, and gold and exotic goods that had traveled up from deeper in this land, from West Africa and beyond. Their navigators hugged coasts and also pushed past them, out through the pillars of Heracles into the Atlantic, charting shorelines long before later European explorers claimed discovery. Rome knew this. Rome feared this. The three Punic Wars were not random clashes. They were an escalating drama, a struggle over who would name the sea and through it, the surrounding lands. The First Punic War was rivalry. Two rising powers colliding over Sicily, over trade, over who would tax whose ships. Rome won, but it was a bitter, expensive victory, and Carthage did not bow. It rebuilt, turned west, dug deeper into Iberia, gathered new wealth, new soldiers. Then came Hannibal and the Second Punic War. This was not just strategy. This was revenge. War elephants crossing the Alps, Numidian horsemen riding with Carthage, harassing Roman legions, humiliating them at battles like Canon. For a generation, Rome lived with the terror that this land, from its southern shore, could send an army that shattered its myth of invincibility. You need to let that sink in. The South terrifying the North. This coast as the heart of an empire. Carthage was proof that power did not have to flow from Europe outward. It could flow from this land across the water, shaping the world. Rome never forgot that feeling in its chest. So, the Third Punic War was not about balance. It was a fight to the death. Rome could not tolerate an alternative center of power facing it across the sea it wanted to own entirely. And when an empire truly fears another, it does not just conquer it, it tries to erase it. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. Because when Rome burned Carthage, it was not only destroying walls and ships, it was preparing to overwrite names of cities, of provinces, of this land itself. And the word that would rise from those ashes is the word you were taught to use today. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. How to erase a rival, the burning of Carthage and the birth of Africa. So let us go back, not to a classroom, but to a city on fire, Carthage. Night turned to daylight by flame, Roman legions pouring through broken walls, shields locked, swords drawn, faces set with the cold focus of a people who have decided that their enemy will not only lose, but vanish. Street by street, house by house, they advance. This land echoed with screams, with steel on stone, with the crack of doors smashed from their hinges. There were temples here, once filled with incense and song. There were libraries here, records of trade that stretched across the Mediterranean and far down into this land. There were children here, pressed into corners, watching fire climb the beams of their homes. Rome did not stop. The legions turned streets into battlegrounds, homes into pyres, sanctuaries into smoke. When the fighting ended, the survivors were chained, dragged away as property, while engineers calmly began to dismantle what was left of the city's power. Most people have heard the story that Rome salted the earth of Carthage, that the Romans walked the ruins, scattering salt so nothing would ever grow there again. Historians argue over whether the salt was literal or symbolic, whether a handful of grains ever actually touched that soil. But that is not the point. The story itself reveals the intention, not just to defeat Carthage in war, but to sterilize the ground of memory, to make sure nothing like Carthage would rise there again, not in stone, not in story, not even in the imagination of the world. And when the flames cooled, Rome did what empires do next. It named. On the charred bones of Carthage, the Roman state formalized a new province, Africa, Africa Proconsularis. In their administrative records, in military dispatches, in tax registers, that word marked a specific slice of North Africa, centered on the land they had just broken. The name of the rival was being replaced by the name of the victor. But even that Roman word was not born in Rome. There were older tongues on this land. Many scholars point to local Berber terms, Ifri, Ifran, words linked to caves, to cave dwellers, to particular tribes and places. A small, precise name, rooted in the lives of specific people, was taken, stretched, repurposed by an empire that saw the world as provinces on a map, not as civilizations with their own sacred names. That is the first truth most people miss. First, you burn the rival city. Then you rename the land around its ashes. Then, centuries later, that provincial label creeps outward on European maps until it covers an entire continent, while the older names of this land and the memory of Carthage's power fade into a quiet footnote. You need to see the pattern, not just know it, feel it in your chest. Because if Africa began as one Roman province on conquered Carthaginian soil, what was the name of the whole that came before? What did this land call itself before Rome, before Europe, before the maps you were taught to trust? The answer to that question is older than Carthage's fires and far more dangerous to forget. From province to continent, how Africa swallowed 1,000 names. The answer to that question did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly as empire expanded. The name Africa did not begin as a word for this land in its fullness. It began as a label for a wound Rome had carved into the north. Let us go back. When Rome finally crushed Carthage, when its legions poured salt into the soil of a rival they feared, they created a new province on that conquered ground. They called it Africa Proconsularis. Not Mali, not Kush, not Ethiopia. A bureaucratic title for a sliver of coastline around modern Tunisia, bleeding into parts of Algeria and Libya. A Roman cage thrown over Punic and Berber worlds that already had their own names. That is the first truth most people miss. Africa was once a small word, a provincial word, a word that hugged the Mediterranean shore, while the rest of this land pulsed with civilizations Rome had never seen. To the south and east, empires rose and fell with no interest in being Roman paperwork. Centuries later, when Rome's Latin faded and Arabic rose along those same coasts, the name shifted, but the pattern did not. Muslim geographers spoke of Ifriqiya, an echo of Africa, again centered around Tunisia and its surroundings. Still, not the whole. Still, just a slice. The Sahara stretched beyond. The Sahel breathed beyond. Forests, rivers, gold routes, holy cities, all beyond the reach of that narrow word. But then came the maps, European maps. From the 15th century onward, as Portuguese caravels scraped along the western shoreline, as Spanish, Dutch, French, and English ships pushed further south, the small Roman name began to swell. On parchment in Lisbon and Seville, Africa slid down the coast. On charts in Amsterdam and London, it crawled inward, across deserts no European had crossed, across kingdoms they had only heard about in rumor. It was convenient. One label, one color wash on the page, one vast Africa to divide into colonies and trading zones, to carve into West Africa, East Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa for their own administrative comfort. This land became a filing system. On the ground, that fiction did not hold. There were Malians bound to the Niger's bend and its gold. There were Ethiopians rooted in highland churches and older Kushite memories. There were Congolese along the Great River, Swahili city-states on the Indian Ocean, Shona stone builders, Yoruba polities with sacred groves and intricate lineages. Their maps were not blank. Their worlds were not waiting for a European name. Yet, as the word Africa spread in European mouths, those inner names were flattened in European eyes. One place, one people, one problem. A single, distant other that could be enslaved, extracted, ruled. When you erase the names of hundreds of nations and replace them with one foreign syllable, that is not neutral geography. That is a quiet violence. It makes it easier to ship human beings across oceans as Africans, easier to strip mines and forests from Africa, easier to speak of a whole origin land as poor, backward, needing civilization. You need to hear the weight of this. Every time you say Africa, you are holding a Roman province, an Arabic region, and a European colonial category in your mouth. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. Not just know it, feel it in your chest. Because this is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. If the people of this land did not choose this continental name, whose story are you repeating? And what older name, what older memory is still waiting beneath it, unspoken, refusing to die? The names beneath Africa, Alkebulan in the forgotten worldview, so let us go back. Not on a map drawn in Rome, not on a globe in a classroom, But beneath the paper, beneath the ink, down to the names that lived here before anyone said Africa with a conqueror's tongue. Slow down with me for a moment. Breathe. Because what comes next is not about swapping one label for another. It is about touching a buried worldview, a way the people of this land understood themselves before the world was taught to see them as a periphery. In the records of Moorish scholars, in manuscripts passed through Arabic and older tongues, a different word appears for this land. Alkebulan. Say it slowly in your mind. Alkebulan. It has been translated as mother of mankind, as Garden of Eden, as the cradle where human beings first stood upright and named the stars. That is the first truth most people miss. This land was not imagined as the edge of the world. It was imagined as the beginning. When you call a place mother of mankind, you do not treat it as a resource depot. You do not reduce it to a third world waiting for development. You speak as if you are standing in the house of your ancestors, on soil that remembers your first breath. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. Not just know it, feel it in your chest. Now, you need to hear this clearly. Mainstream academia does not agree on Alkebulan. Scholars argue over how old the term is, which languages shaped it, whether it ever named the whole land or only certain regions. Some say it was used mainly by Moors and Muslim geographers. Others question its reach entirely. The debates are real. They are not the enemy. But even in that argument, something breaks through. The mere existence of a name like Alkebulan exposes an older way of seeing this land, not as Africa, a Roman province stretched by European cartographers until it smothered a continent, but as an origin, a living source with its own inner names and sacred directions. There were other names as well, each holding a piece of that worldview. Tameri, the beloved land in the Nile Valley. Kush, the kingdom to the south, whose pyramids still cut the horizon. Ethiopia, once used in a broader sense for burnt-faced peoples, the Greeks spoke of with awe, whose piety, Homer said, drew the gods themselves to feast among them. These were not just labels. They were coordinates in a spiritual geography. In that geography, this land is not marginal. It is first home. Rivers like the Nile and Niger are not lines on a shipping chart. They are veins. Deserts like the Sahara are not empty. They are vast pages where caravans read the wind and stars as scripture. Mountains are not obstacles. They are altars. So when you speak the name Alkebulan, understand what you are doing. You are not claiming a perfect, uncontested historical term. You are reclaiming a right, the right of a people to name themselves. To remember that before Africa, there were words that called this land mother, source, and center, and those words are still waiting for you to answer them. This is not a history lesson. It's a mirror. Those words are still waiting for you to answer them, but this is where it turns, because this is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. This is a mirror being held up to you, to how you have been trained to see this land and, through it, yourself. You were taught to say Africa like it was one flat color, one place, one culture, one story. That is the first truth most people miss. When you say Africa, you are using a name stretched by Rome, by maps, by empires, until entire civilizations were folded into a single vague sound, while their own names were pushed to the margins of memory. Feel what that means. Numidia becomes a footnote. Carthage becomes a myth. Kush, with its forests of pyramids, becomes a passing reference. Great Zimbabwe, with its stone cities, becomes a question mark. There were people on this land who carved their genius into stone, into trade routes, into astronomy and law, and the world was taught to file all of that under one word and move on. You need to sit with the grief in that. Generations of people whose names you will never hear, kingdoms whose titles were never written into your school books, priests and mathematicians, sailors and queens, whose languages carried sacred names for rivers, mountains, and this land itself, but whose words were broken, mispronounced, or erased so that Africa could stand alone. But this is not only about loss, it is about pride. Knowing names like Numidia, Kush, Axum, Great Zimbabwe, Kemet, and hearing older terms like Alkebulan is not about rejecting the word Africa and walking away. It is about expanding it, deepening it, refusing to let it remain a shallow, colonial shorthand for a place that once called itself Mother of Mankind. Ask yourself what it means to call yourself African, or to speak about Africa without knowing the layers beneath that word. How different does it feel when you remember that this land has been described as the garden, the origin, the cradle where humanity first stood upright and named the stars? By the time you finish this, you will feel it, not just know it, feel it in your chest. Because once you know that names can be weapons or prayers, you cannot use them carelessly anymore. Every time you say Africa, you are choosing which story you keep alive. The administrative province Rome drew on a map, or the living continent whose people named it as source and center. From here, the question is no longer, what is the real name? The question is, what name will you serve when you open your mouth next? And to answer that, we have to follow the word Africa into the modern world, into borders, passports, and flags, and see what it has been doing to you without your consent. What you do with this name now. So now, you have followed that word, Africa, from a tiny Roman province to an entire continent stamped on maps, passports, and your own tongue without your consent. You have watched Rome stretch a local label across this land until most people forgot that before Africa, there were other names, other worlds, other centers. You saw the shadows where Numidia used to ride, where Numidians once humbled legions that thought themselves invincible. You walked the burned shoreline where Carthage stood, not just a city, but a power that made Rome shake. You heard the echoes of Kush and Kemet, of Axum and Great Zimbabwe, of civilizations that did not see themselves as one vague Africa, but as specific, rooted, radiant expressions of this land. You heard how Alkebulan surfaced in manuscripts and memories carried by Moors and Muslim scholars, translated as Mother of Mankind, Garden of Eden, a name that places this land at the center of the world, not its edge. That is the first truth most people miss. This land named itself as origin long before it was renamed as object. So what do you do with that now? You do not just nod and move on. You need to unlearn. You need to relearn. You need to train your eyes and your mouth to stop accepting the map as the territory, the colonial label as the only name. When you see a schoolbook map, do not let your gaze slide over a single orange or green mass labeled Africa. Stop. Interrupt yourself. Say the names under your breath. Numidia, Carthage, Kush, Kemet, Aksum, Great Zimbabwe. Let them stack in your mind until the flat color breaks apart into civilizations, into people, into power. When you have a quiet moment, look them up. Read how Nubian kings once ruled Egypt. Read how Aksum minted its own coins and carved its own stelae. Read how the Moors carried algebra and astronomy into Europe. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. By the time you finish this, you will feel it, not just know it. Feel it in your chest when you say the word Africa again. Here's a practical shift. Keep using the word if you must, but never use it empty. When you say Africa, pause for half a heartbeat. In that pause, whisper Alkebulan inside your mind. In that pause, see faces, see cities, see deserts and forests and libraries, not a blank, homogeneous mass. Begin to speak in specifics. Say, the people of Kemet, the kingdoms of Kush, the empires of the Sahel, the Swahili coast, instead of one dull, distant, over there in Africa. Refuse to let this land be one nameless background in your sentences. Do not keep this to yourself. Send this story to someone whose map is still flat. Share it with friends, with family, with classrooms, with communities, not as trivia, as invitation. An invitation to see this land as origin, not afterthought, as mother, not margin. They lied to you about the name of this land. They taught you Africa and buried Alkebulan. Now you know at least one older name. From this day forward, what you choose to call this land is not neutral. It is part of the story you are writing about yourself and which side of history you decide to stand on when you open your mouth next.